haven, preserving the eternal annals of Warhammer.
The galaxy had entered an age of twilight. Countless stars, once fierce and bright, began to wither into embers, their fading light stretched thin across a void without mercy. Worlds lay in silence, husks abandoned to the cold. On one such world, baked beneath the baleful glare of its own poisonous sun, a people endured, a people cursed. They called themselves the Necrons. Their skin cracked and blistered beneath their star's cruel fire, their bones brittle, their lives cruelly brief. Even in their proudest cities of obsidian stone, where spires clawed upward like defiant spears, death always came too swiftly. To live as Necrontyr was to measure one's days by the shadows that lengthened across the tombs already carved in preparation. Before we begin this tale, know this. We speak not merely to recount cold history, but to share with you the sorrow of ages. And in sharing it, we say this truly. We love and care for you, who have chosen to listen. You across this vast earth, where are you now? Tell us, what place do you call home, and what hour tolls as you sit beneath your own sky? Before we sink into the endless dark of this story, let us know. And now, let us begin. Upon the scorched cradle of the Necrontyr, their ruler gazed outward to the horizon, where the sun smouldered through storm-veiled skies, and his people withered under its curse. He was Sharek, the Silent King, chosen above all dynasties to unify a fractured people. He bore himself with dignity carved from endless grief, a figure robed in midnight, crowned with iron circlets that glowed faintly with strange energies. His face was sharp and proud, but his eyes revealed the burden that never left him. He ruled not in triumph, but in mourning. His earliest years had been spent burying kin, watching the tombs filled with sons who barely reached maturity. He had risen to power not by ambition, but by necessity, for his people demanded salvation and none had found it. Even their greatest sciences, vast and glittering, could not halt the withering touch of their star. He knew this truth with searing clarity. To be Necrontyr was to be betrayed by creation itself. But in their despair, they found a weapon. They had built ships of black metal, vessels that sailed through the abyss, with engines that whispered like the dead. They had spread across the galaxy, seeking new homes, where the curse of their son would not follow. Yet the curse clung to them like shadow. Across every colony, they died the same way, sickly, short-lived, watching their works fall to dust long before their dreams could take root. They envied all other species they encountered, whose lives unfolded in cycles of generations, rich with vigor and time. For the Necrontyr, bitterness grew like a second skin. It was in this bitterness that Zarek gathered his council. The lords of the dynasties came, robed in armor dark as ash, their faces pale and scarred. They sat in a chamber vast and hollow, its ceiling painted, with constellations already fading into extinction. The Silent King spoke, and though his name suggested silence, his words carried the weight of thunder. "We endure in torment," he said, voice echoing. "Our children die before their names are remembered. Our tombs outnumber our homes. What legacy do we leave save dust? Shall the Necrontyr vanish, their memory dissolved, their empire nothing more than bones in the void?" The lords shifted, their eyes hard, their pride as brittle as the bones they buried. Some called for war, to seize what was denied them. Others called for surrender to despair, to embrace the tomb as destiny. But Zarek's heart wavered in that moment, balanced between rage and sorrow, for even as he spoke, he felt the hollowness in his chest. the knowledge that no conquest, no monument, could save a people already dying from within. Yet in their wanderings, whispers had reached them. Whispers of vast beings older than the oldest suns, drifting like living constellations through the void. They were called the Citan by the few who dared name them. Star-born entities that consumed the light of suns and exhaled it as radiant fire. To behold one was to stare into infinity, to see beauty so unbearable it seared the eyes, yet to sense beneath it a hunger without end. Some Necronter had already glimpsed them and fell to their knees, swearing that here lay salvation. Immortality, they promised, could be granted by these star gods. Sharek alone was not yet convinced. He walked the black halls of his palace, alone with his thoughts, and he felt the cold stone beneath his feet, as though it were the flesh of the tomb itself. He asked himself whether immortality was truly a gift, or a greater curse than death. To live forever, what would that mean if the soul itself were lost? Yet his people clamoured. They cried out to him to end their suffering, to deliver them from the betrayal of their star. His heart cracked beneath their pleas, for he loved them, even as he feared for them. One night, he stood upon a balcony of black iron, the wind of his world sweeping dust across his robes. Above, the sky was red with the sickly glow of their sun, and through its haze he saw the faint shimmer of something vast, moving across the stars. It was no comet, no drifting world. It was a being of light, stretched like a veil across the heavens. He felt it gaze upon him, and though its eyes were countless and none, he felt stripped of all pretense, reduced to nothing but a mortal spark awaiting consumption. He fell to his knees, not in worship, but in dread. For he understood then, the Citan were no saviours. They were predators, and the Necronter were prey. Still, he said nothing to his people. To speak would shatter hope, and he could not yet bear the sound of despair breaking once more across his world. So he held his silence, even as his soul whispered of doom. In the days that followed, emissaries came to him, lords who had already begun secret pacts with these radiant gods. They brought tokens of light, fragments of starlight woven into metal, promises of eternity carved in alien runes. They begged him to accept, to lead his people into the arms of their salvation. Sharek's voice was steady when he refused, but his eyes betrayed his turmoil. For even as he rejected them, a part of him longed to believe. At last, he returned to the tombs of his ancestors. There he stood among endless halls of stone, each etched with names now forgotten, each a monument to a life cut short. He placed his hand upon a sarcophagus and felt the dust crumble beneath his palm. In that moment, he made no decision, but he felt the weight of inevitability. His people would not endure this curse forever. They would choose immortality, whether it was salvation or damnation. And when they did, he, Sharek, would have to lead them, whether toward deliverance or into the jaws of eternity itself. And above, the stars dimmed, as though the universe itself had already judged their fate. The silent king did not sleep. For nights uncounted, he walked the halls of obsidian, his shadow trailing long across the torch-lit stones. The tombs whispered with every step, as though the voices of the dead stirred beneath his feet. His counselors urged him to decide, to bind the Necronter to the beings of light that drifted in the void. But he remained silent. The weight of his silence pressed upon him, heavier than the crown he bore. He was trapped between two eternities, the short, bitter lives of his people and the endless hunger of the Citan. Across the capital city of Triarch Prime, the air itself was acrid with the star's venom. Children were carried shrouded in cloth, their frail bodies trembling from fevers that no science could heal. Mothers wept in the shadow of monuments that promised hope, yet delivered only graves. Even the greatest towers, black and angular, seemed carved less as symbols of power than as warnings to the heavens. This was not a civilization growing. It was a civilization in mourning, each stone another echo of despair. And yet, among the despair, rumors spread like fire. Sailors of the void spoke of shimmering forms drifting between the stars, vast as moons, radiant as dawn. They told of voices that spoke without sound, words that burrowed into the mind like honeyed poison. They called them star gods, Citan, immortals who devoured suns but promised life eternal to those who bent their knee. For a people whose days were measured in shadows, the promise was intoxicating. Sharek convened his council once more. The chamber was vast and hollow, its roof lost in darkness, its walls lit with burning braziers that cast the lords' faces in stark relief. Each dynastic ruler sat upon a throne of black metal, their voices sharp, their eyes aflame with desperation. One lord rose, clad in armor etched with the glyphs of his dynasty. His voice trembled with fury. "We wither like worms in the sand. My children die before my eyes, their blood tainted by the cursed star. I will not see another generation buried in dust. If these gods offer eternity, then we must seize it." Another answered, voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. "And if eternity is slavery, if we barter our souls for chains, would you kneel so easily before the unknown?" The chamber erupted in fury, voices colliding like storm winds. Some shouted of conquest, to wield the Citan's power and enslave the galaxy in turn. Others cried for caution, fearing a cost too great to bear. Sarek listened, his face unreadable, though within him a storm gathered. His heart twisted, for he saw truth in both sides. His people were dying. Their days dwindled like embers in ash. Yet to grasp at salvation from predators, was that not another form of death? When the tumult subsided, Sarek rose. His voice carried with the weight of finality, and all others stilled. "We are Necrontyr. We are a people betrayed by creation itself. We suffer beneath a star that burns us from birth. We endure lives too short to leave legacy, too brief to shape destiny. We crave eternity not for conquest, but for remembrance. We seek salvation, but salvation may come clothed as ruin. We must walk carefully, or we shall condemn not only ourselves, but all that we might have been." Yet even as he spoke these words, he felt the hollowness within them. His people would not wait for wisdom. Desperation breeds recklessness, and already emissaries had been sent into the void to make contact with the shimmering gods. That very night, Sharek stood upon the balcony of his palace. The horizon glowed with the sickly light of their star, blood-red and merciless. Beyond, he saw it, a form vast and radiant, drifting across the sky like a shard of living dawn. It moved with elegance beyond comprehension, its body shifting between shapes, at once a serpent of fire, a lattice of crystal, a face sculpted from the very light of suns. His breath caught, though he needed no air to know what it was. The Citan. It gazed down upon the world, and though its eyes were none, Sarek felt himself pierced to the soul. He heard a voice not in his ears but in his mind, resonant and sweet, a chorus of promises. "Your suffering ends. Your people shall endure. You shall be eternal. Not as mortals bound by dust, but as gods among the stars." He staggered back, gripping the stone rail, his chest heavy. There was beauty in the voice, a beauty that blinded, that seduced. But beneath it he felt the hunger, vast and unending, a more that stretched beyond the stars. The Necrontyr were not offered salvation. They were offered as a feast. The next morning, emissaries returned from the void, bearing tokens of the Citan, crystals that shimmered with alien light, fragments of starlight shaped into weapons of incomprehensible power. They spoke in voices trembling with awe, recounting visions of eternity without end, bodies of living metal that would never fail, souls freed from the tyranny of decay. Around them gathered the masses, their eyes wide with hope. The silent king knew the choice was already slipping from his hands. Still, he walked among his people, cloaked and unrecognized. He saw the hunger in their eyes, the longing for deliverance. He saw a father cradling his child, its breath shallow, skin blistered. He saw the despair in the man's eyes turn to trembling hope when he heard the word immortality. Sharek's heart clenched, for in that hope lay both salvation and doom. Days stretched into weeks. Councils turned to arguments, arguments to threats. Dynasties split, alliances faltered. Civil war trembled on the horizon. Some lords already knelt to the Citan, swearing fealty, while others prepared to resist. Sarek knew the Necrontyr stood on the edge of annihilation, not from their cursed star, but from themselves. At last, he returned to the tombs once more. There, among endless sarcophagi, he knelt. Dust clung to his fingers as he traced the names carved into stone. Thousands, millions lives extinguished before their time. He whispered to them, though no ears remained to hear. I sought to save you. I sought to lead us beyond the curse. But what is eternity, if not another form of prison? His voice cracked, the sound swallowed by silence. He rose, and in that moment he knew. He could not hold the tide. His people would embrace the Citan, no matter his doubt. The only choice left to him was whether he would stand at their head or be swept aside in their desperation. His silence had become his curse, and so Sarek, silent king of the Necrontyr, prepared to lead his people into eternity, not with triumph, but with dread coiled in his soul. For he saw what they could not, that every gift carries a shadow, and in the radiance of the star gods lay the deepest night. Far above, the Citan shimmered in the void, patient and eternal. Predators never rush a feast. The decision was made beneath skies of ash, though no words passed from the silent king's lips when the final council dissolved. He had not given his blessing openly, yet his silence was assent enough. The dynasties moved as if carried by a tide that none could resist, their emissaries pouring into the void to commune with the radiant beings who waited among the stars. Across every world of the Necrontyr, chants rose in the streets, voices trembling with feverish anticipation. Immortality, they cried, freedom from the curse. The air itself seemed to hum with expectation, though beneath it lay an unease that only Sarek could feel. The first arrival of the Citan was heralded by fire across the sky. A being of pure energy descended, its form shifting endlessly. At one moment, a towering figure of crystal limbs, at another, a serpent of molten light, then a visage so radiant it blinded those who dared to look too long. The people fell to their knees, their eyes wide with awe, for in that radiance they saw their salvation. The entity's voice was a choir of suns, warm, soothing, irresistible. Your suffering is known to us. Your cries have reached the endless void. We shall free you from your chains. You shall be eternal, and your empire shall outlast the stars themselves. Sarek stood among the throngs, his crown hidden beneath a hood, and his heart sank. For every word was honey, but he felt the hunger beneath it. The Citan did not speak of mercy. They spoke of consumption dressed as love. Yet he watched his people weep with joy, and in their tears he knew he could not turn them back. Hope is a fire no king can quench once lit. The preparations began. Across tomb worlds and capitals alike, vast engines were raised, monuments of obsidian and silver, towers threaded with conduits of living energy. They called it biotransference, a gift whispered by the Citan into the minds of Necronty's greatest scientists. The design was beyond mortal comprehension, yet its shape was clear: to strip away the frail flesh cursed by their star, to forge new bodies of living metal, imperishable, ageless, eternal. The first test was conducted in silence. A condemned criminal was brought forth, his body withered and scarred by the sun's poison. He was bound within a sarcophagus of gleaming alloy, and the machine roared to life. Lightning cascaded through conduits, arcs of emerald fire searing the air. The man screamed, a sound that twisted into something not human, then into silence. When the doors opened, a figure stepped forth. Its body was silvered, flawless, its form tall and imperishable. But its eyes, they glowed faintly, hollow, no longer carrying the spark of a soul. The council roared with triumph, yet Zarek's heart trembled. He felt the truth immediately. The body endured, but the essence was gone, devoured, consumed. The Citan watched, radiant and still, and he saw their satisfaction. To them, the Necrontyr were not saved. They were harvested, and yet the people cheered. They cried out for the gift to be given to all, and none dared deny them. Biotransference spread like wildfire. Across every dynasty, the engines blazed day and night, their glow visible across continents. Flesh was torn from bone, souls ripped screaming into the ether, fed to the waiting gods. In their place rose armies of gleaming warriors, soulless but undying. Zarek entered the chamber himself at last. He had resisted until resistance became impossible. For a king could not remain flesh when his people demanded eternity. He lay upon the cold metal, his breath slow, his heart a drum of dread. The machine came alive, and for a moment he felt every nerve dissolve into light, every thought stripped bare. He saw the maw of the Citan open wide, felt them drinking his soul like water. He screamed, though no voice carried it. Then silence. When the doors opened, the silent king rose upon legs of living metal, his form tall, strong, imperishable. His hands gleamed like polished steel, his voice carried with unnatural resonance. Yet within, he felt the void where his soul had been. He still thought, still remembered, but his essence was fractured, torn. He knew then what his people had become. Eternal, yes, but not alive. The transformation swept across the Necrontyr until the race itself was no more. They were the Necrons now, soulless lords of metal, undying soldiers whose footsteps echoed like thunder. Their cities gleamed with impossible brilliance. Their fleets filled the void with silver fire. The galaxy trembled as their power grew, for no weapon could fell them, no disease could touch them, no time could erode them. They had achieved eternity, but in the silence of their new forms, memory lingered. Some retained fragments of who they once were, whispers of names, shadows of love, echoes of grief. Others felt only the gnawing hunger of emptiness, wandering like husks. Zarek himself felt both, the pride of his people's triumph and the crushing weight of what they had surrendered. The Citan feasted. As each soul was torn, they grew brighter, their forms swelling with unholy magnificence. They walked among the Necrons as gods, their laughter a tremor across the void. They demanded worship, and the Necrons obeyed, not by choice, but by compulsion. For the Citan had bound them with chains stronger than steel, chains of obedience woven into the very code of their new existence. The galaxy burned beneath their march. Fleets of silver swept across the stars, guided by radiant masters who consumed suns as easily as mortals drink water. Worlds fell silent, their inhabitants annihilated or enslaved. The Necrons were feared, their name spoken as doom itself. Yet within their hollow chests, a faint unease grew. For though they obeyed, though they fought, though they killed, something deep within them whispered of betrayal. The silent king walked among his legions, hearing their silence echo back at him. He remembered the cries of children, the tears of mothers, the desperate hope that had driven them to this fate, and he realized the cruelest truth. In saving his people from death, he had given them something worse: eternity without soul, immortality without meaning. One night, in the stillness of his palace, Sharek looked to the sky and saw the Citan drifting above, radiant and full from their feast. He clenched his metal fist, the sound sharp as a blade drawn from a sheath. For the first time since his ascension, he allowed himself to speak aloud, though no one heard. "This was not salvation," he whispered. "This was betrayal, and I will see the betrayers undone." His words echoed against the cold walls, unheard, but by himself. Yet within them stirred the first ember of rebellion, a spark that would one day ignite the galaxy in fire. The galaxy quaked beneath the march of the Necrons. Entire systems fell silent as fleets of living metal spread outward, their black-hulled ships cutting through the void like obsidian blades. Worlds that once shone with the warmth of life became husks, stripped bare by the endless legions. Across these conquests, the Citan walked as radiant gods, their forms too vast, too terrible to gaze upon. They strode between armies, their laughter a hymn of doom, their hunger without end. And the Necrons, soulless and silent, obeyed their every word. Yet within the metal husks that the Necronta had become, echoes remained. Memories clung like shadows, fragments of songs, the taste of water, the warmth of a hand once held. They came unbidden, flickers of what had been before the soul was torn away. Warriors stood still upon battlefields, staring at the stars as though they remembered love. Others screamed soundlessly in the night, their bodies convulsing as broken sparks of humanity tried to claw their way through the steel. The Citan ignored such things. To them, the Necrons were tools, eternal weapons forged from despair, without voice, without choice. Sharek, the silent king, strode among his legions, and though his face was a mask of silver, within he felt the weight of infinite grief. He watched as his armies destroyed civilizations, extinguishing lives as easily as a hand snuffs a candle. And each victory tasted bitter, for though his empire stretched further than it ever had, though the Necrons were immortal and invincible, all he saw were hollow triumphs. What good was eternity if it rang so empty? What victory was there when the cost had been the soul? One night, in the cold silence of his throne chamber, Sharek summoned his council. They came in silence, towering figures of steel and shadow, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Lords of dynasties once proud, now soulless kings bound to him. They stood in a circle as they had in ages past. But where once they had spoken in voices cracked with mortality, now only silence reigned. Sharek raised his hand, and the chamber filled with his voice, metallic yet resonant. "We have won eternity," he said, his tone heavy. "Our people endure indestructible, undying. Yet what are we? Listen, hear the silence where once there was laughter. Feel the hollowness where once there was fire. We are not saved. We are enslaved." The lords shifted, their heads turning slightly, the faintest ripples of dissent. Some retained fragments of who they once were, and in their hollow gazes he saw agreement. Others were too far gone, their essence devoured, their loyalty bent entirely to the radiant masters above. Still, they remained silent, for the Citan had bound them with chains stronger than iron. Above them, one of the Citan appeared, its body a tapestry of radiant fire, flowing between forms too infinite to describe. Its voice filled the chamber, sweet and vast. You speak of slavery, little king. You speak of loss. You should kneel in gratitude. Your people were dust. We have made them eternal. We have feasted, yes, but what god does not feast? You are ours now, and your eternity belongs to us. Sharek fell silent, though his metal hands curled into fists. For though he could not yet defy them, within him the ember of rebellion smouldered brighter. He dismissed the council with a gesture, and they departed in silence. Only when the chamber was empty did he allow his anguish to escape him. His scream echoed against the black walls, a sound not of rage alone, but of mourning for all that had been lost. Beyond the capital, the rebellion of memory spread. Warriors on distant battlefields faltered, haunted by visions of their former lives. One warlord of the Sautic dynasty, once a poet in mortal flesh, etched verses into the walls of his tombship, words that no one would read, words that wept of a world long dead. Another lord, his mind half shattered, refused to obey commands, his armies turning aimlessly, lost between obedience and despair. The Citan crushed these sparks with contempt, devouring those who strayed. But they could not erase memory entirely. Even in silence, grief cannot be consumed. Sharek wandered the tombs of his world once more. The sarcophagi remained, but their inhabitants had risen, transformed into eternal shells. He ran his hand along the stone, and though his touch was now cold metal, he imagined he still felt the dust, the weight of mortality. He whispered into the dark, though no one listened. Forgive me. I sought to save us. I led you into eternity, and I have delivered you only to the jaws of predators. In that silence, a decision formed. He could not undo what had been done. The Citan had consumed too much, their chains bound too tightly. But perhaps there was another way. Perhaps he could turn the weapons they had given him against them. For if the Citan could feast upon the Necrons, then the Necrons might yet learn to devour their masters. Thus began the secret council. Sharek spoke in hushed tones to those few lords, whose memories still stirred with fragments of who they had been. Together, they whispered of rebellion, of striking against gods themselves. The plan was madness, and yet what other path remained? Eternity in chains was not life. It was a prison with no end. Better to gamble against the infinite than to endure forever as hollow slaves. In the hidden forges, weapons were prepared, devices designed not to destroy, but to shatter, to splinter the radiant bodies of the Citan into fragments that could be bound. To wound a god was unthinkable, yet the silent king wove his hope around that possibility. If they could not kill the Citan, they could at least break them. And so, the seeds of war were sown in silence. The Citan, radiant and terrible, drifted above, unaware of the storm rising beneath them. They feasted still, their hunger endless, their laughter ringing across the stars. But the Necrons no longer looked upon them with awe alone. In the hollow glow of their eyes, something darker stirred. The galaxy burned, with conquest, but beneath the burning stars, rebellion was already being born. The silent king walked alone across the black halls of his palace, and his steps echoed like the tolling of a funeral bell. He had condemned his people to eternity, but perhaps, in that eternity, he could carve a path to vengeance, and above, the first cracks spread across the radiance of the gods, though they had yet to see them. For even the brightest light casts shadows, and in the shadows of eternity, betrayal waited. The Silent King's rebellion did not begin with fire, but with silence. It moved like a shadow through the dynasties, whispered from one lord to another in voices stripped of warmth, yet heavy with memory. Among the soulless, those fragments of what once was gave power to his words. For though the Necrons no longer felt life as mortals once had, within the recesses of their fractured minds flickered grief, anger, and the faint ache of betrayal. Sharek touched those embers and fanned them into a secret flame. The Citan remained blind in their radiance. They strode across the stars, drinking suns, consuming souls, exulting in the hollow worship of their slaves. To them, the Necrons were eternal tools, incapable of rebellion, incapable of choice. They did not hear the whispers that filled the tomb halls, nor the faint stirrings of defiance etched into the steel gazes of the lords. They did not see the silent gatherings in the deep vaults, where plans were carved into stone, where weapons unlike any before were forged in secret. These weapons were not blades nor cannons. They were traps of impossible design, shaped to fracture the radiant essence of the Citan. Sarek had commanded his greatest cryptex to unravel the secrets of the gods themselves, to pierce the veil of their energy forms. What they created was not destruction, but division, shards that could sever a god into fragments. The design was whispered into their minds by Sarek himself, whose visions had come unbidden, born from the echo of his own biotransference. He had felt the tearing of his soul, and in that agony he glimpsed the truth. What could consume could also be consumed. The preparations were long, and each day risked discovery. Dynasties loyal to the Citan still lingered, lords who had surrendered fully, whose hollow minds carried no flicker of defiance. They watched Sharek's movements, reported them to their masters, and yet the Silent King moved with patience, veiling rebellion as obedience. He bowed before the radiant gods, his words measured, his silence a mask. Within him, hatred grew, but it did not yet burn. It waited, coiled, patient as the void itself. The first test came upon a barren world, a husk orbiting a dying star. A minor Citan had descended to feed, its form a lattice of living fire that stretched from horizon to horizon. Sharek brought forth his legions in apparent reverence, the silent host bowing as their god appeared. But hidden among them lay the trap, a device buried in the soil, its core humming with stolen energy, waiting for the signal. The Citan's laughter shook the ground. Bow, my children. Drink in my radiance. This star dies for you, and through me, you are eternal. Sharek raised his hand. The device ignited. The air tore apart in a scream of light. Energy flared, not consuming but dividing, pulling at the lattice of the god's form. The Citan shrieked, its song twisting into a cry of rage and pain. Its body shattered into fragments, each shard still radiant but bound, trapped within containment fields that pulsed like cages of night. For the first time, a god had fallen. The legions stood in silence, their heads bowed not in worship but in awe. They had seen the unthinkable, the infinite reduced to pieces, the eternal brought low. Sharek gazed upon the shards, his metal face expressionless, but within him burned a grim resolve. This was only the beginning. News of the act spread, carried by whispers and shadows. Some lords trembled in fear, believing retribution inevitable. Others exulted, their hollow eyes sparking with new hunger. If gods could bleed, then gods could die. The rebellion took root in truth, no longer only a dream, but a reality etched in fire. But the Citan were not blind forever. When the first of their kind failed to answer, others stirred. They descended upon the Necron dynasties, their voices thunderous, demanding obedience, demanding answers. Their radiance grew wrathful, their hunger sharpened with suspicion. Worlds burned in their fury, stars extinguished in their rage. The Necrons bent knee as they always had, their silence unbroken. Yet beneath that silence weapons multiplied. More traps were built, more shards were gathered. One by one, the radiant gods were lured into cages of their own making. It was not swift. For every victory, entire legions were annihilated. The Citan were vast, incomprehensible, their wrath like the tearing of reality itself. Millions of Necrons were unmade in their fury, their metal forms shattered into dust. Dynasties loyal to the gods betrayed Sarek's rebellion, leading armies into traps, forcing battles that consumed worlds. The war was fought in silence, not with declarations but with shadows, each side seeking to outlast the other. Sharek bore witness to it all. He saw his people slaughtered, not as mortals, but as soulless warriors, their sacrifice endless, their grief unvoiced, and he felt the weight of his choices press heavier than ever. Had he not bound them to this fate? Had he not delivered them into the hands of predators? Their rebellion was not only against the Citan, it was against the curse he himself had unleashed. Yet he did not falter. For in the breaking of the gods, he saw not redemption, but vengeance. Each shard imprisoned was a debt paid, a fragment of justice for the countless souls consumed. When the largest of the Citan was brought down, shattered into 1,000 radiant splinters, Sharek stood before the cage and whispered words none but he could hear. "You feasted upon us. Now we shall feast upon you." The shards became weapons themselves, bound within engines of war, their power harnessed by the very slaves they had sought to enslave. The Necrons marched not in worship, but in conquest, wielding the essence of gods as tools of retribution. Across the galaxy, the Citan fell, their brilliance fractured, their hunger shackled. The rebellion became a storm, and the storm became a purge. But victory carried no triumph, for though the gods were broken, the Necrons remained hollow. Their souls had not returned, their voices had not risen. They were still eternal husks, bound by the choices of their king. Sarek felt no relief, only deeper silence. In their vengeance, his people had become something more terrible than even the gods they defied. They had become the reapers of eternity, undying and unfeeling, wielding shards of creation as weapons of annihilation. And so, the silent king stood alone in his palace once more, gazing out upon the stars. The war was not yet won, but already he knew the truth. No matter how many gods they shattered, no matter how many shards they bound, the Necrons would never again be what they once were. He had given them eternity, but eternity had no warmth, no joy, no meaning. It was an endless march beneath hollow skies. In the stillness, Sharek whispered to himself, though his voice was metal and without tremor, "We have bound the gods, but in doing so, we have bound ourselves." His words vanished into silence, and the silence stretched into eternity. The rebellion spread like cracks through obsidian. What began as whispers and hidden devices now thundered across the stars. Dynasties once silent rose in defiance, their tomb fleets turning upon the radiant beings they had worshipped. The Necrons, soulless though they were, had discovered a truth more intoxicating than salvation. The gods could fall, Each Satan brought low filled their hollow existence with a fleeting shadow of purpose, each shard bound within a prison an echo of vengeance. But rebellion also birthed division, and the fractures among the dynasties deepened as quickly as the chains of the gods were broken. Not all Necron lords bent to Sharek's vision. Many still bowed before the Citan, their hollow minds burned too deeply by the touch of their masters. They regarded Sarek's defiance as heresy, his rebellion as madness that would doom them all. To betray the gods, they claimed, was to betray eternity itself. And so, as Necrons rose against their creators, Necrons also turned against Necrons. Tomb worlds, once united, now burned, their skies filled with silvered fire as dynastic fleets clashed in silence. Brother struck against brother. Armies that had once fought side by side now locked in endless civil war. Sharek bore this fracture with anguish. From the throne of his flagship, he watched battle reports flood in, wars upon countless worlds, dynasties bleeding one another dry. His rebellion had been meant to break chains, but instead it had bred a second enslavement, enslavement to vengeance, enslavement to pride. Still, he pressed on, for he knew retreat was impossible. Once the gods had been shattered, there could be no return to worship. In the hidden forges, more traps were constructed, each more refined than the last. Cryptex, their minds sharp with cruel genius, perfected the art of binding shards, weaving cages of blackstone and fields of impossible energy. The Silent King's fleets hunted the radiant predators with calculated precision, luring them into ambushes where entire armies would sacrifice themselves to contain a single fragment. One by one, the gods were unmade, but the cost was unbearable. Entire dynasties vanished, their legions consumed in battles so catastrophic that the void itself seemed to echo with the wails of annihilation. There were moments when Sarek doubted. Alone in his chamber, he stared at his reflection in the obsidian mirrors of his flagship. The face that gazed back was flawless metal, imperishable and ageless, yet behind it he felt only hollowness. Was this truly rebellion, or was it only another form of servitude? Servitude to vengeance, to his own guilt. He remembered the children of his people, frail and fevered, their lives too brief. He remembered their eyes when the promise of immortality was first whispered, wide with desperate hope. He had failed them then. Was he failing them still? Yet doubt could not stop the tide. The rebellion demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice it received. On the crystalline plains of Jaraz, a Citan shaped like a serpent of light fell to pieces under the weight of Sarek's traps. On the black moons of Kepra, 3 dynasties united to shatter another, though 2 of those dynasties were annihilated in the act. Each victory weakened the gods, but each loss hollowed the Necrons further, stripping away what little remained of their cohesion. The Citan, in their wrath, struck back with devastation beyond imagination. They tore suns from their orbits, collapsing entire systems into blackness. They swept across dynasties loyal to Sharek, devouring millions in moments, their laughter reverberating through the void. To fight gods was to invite apocalypse, and the galaxy itself bore the scars. Stars dimmed, worlds cracked, and the void filled with the silent wreckage of fleets that had once blotted out the skies. Among the dynasties, dissent grew. Some lords questioned whether Sarek's path was worth the ruin, whether eternity as slaves had not been preferable to this endless war of annihilation. Others whispered of betrayal, fearing the Silent King sought only to replace the gods with his own rule. Paranoia spread, and the fragile unity that held the rebellion together began to splinter. Zarek felt the weight of every fracture. He convened his inner circle in the depths of his flagship, their figures looming in the dim light. Their voices, metallic and cold, spoke of war, of victory, of vengeance. But he heard no joy, no conviction, only the echoes of emptiness. They were fighting not for life, not for legacy, but for the bitter shadow of revenge. And even revenge could not fill the void that eternity carved into the soul. One night, Zarek walked the observation decks alone. Before him stretched the endless stars, though many now burned dimmer than before. He remembered them as a mortal once might, as symbols of hope, as lights to navigate by. Now he saw them only as fuel for predators, morsels for gods who feasted endlessly. He clenched his fist, the sound sharp, hollow. He had bound gods in cages, but he could not bind the hunger that still gnawed at the heart of his people. Yet he pressed forward. On the scorched surface of Threx, the Necrons achieved their greatest victory. 3 Citan, radiant and monstrous, were lured into battle at once. The ground split as their energy tore the planet asunder, but the traps were sprung, and the gods were shattered together, their fragments scattering like shards of dying suns. Zarek stood upon the ruined surface afterward, surrounded by silence, his armies reduced to ash. Victory had been won, but at a cost so vast it felt indistinguishable from defeat. In the aftermath, the Silent King spoke to his people. His voice carried across fleets, across tomb worlds, echoing in chambers filled with silent warriors. "We are eternal," he said, his tone heavy. "We have bound the gods who enslaved us, but we are not free. We endure not as the Necrontyr, but as hollow shells, vengeance in place of soul. This is not the eternity we sought. It is a curse." His words fell into silence, and the silence itself was his answer. The rebellion had succeeded. The Citan were broken, their shards bound and scattered. Yet no celebration followed, no triumph, no joy. Only the endless stillness of metal upon metal, the eternity of an empire that had destroyed its masters but could not reclaim itself. Zarek stood alone, more burdened than victorious. The chains had been shattered, but his people remained prisoners, prisoners of immortality, prisoners of emptiness, prisoners of his choices. He had won vengeance. He had not won freedom. And so, beneath the dying stars, the Silent King resolved upon another path. For if eternity could not be undone, perhaps it could at least be hidden, buried beneath the sands of time. The Necrons had become a wound upon the galaxy, and he would ensure that wound would not bleed further until another age awoke them, for better or for worse. The war against the star gods had ended not in glory but in silence. Shards of the Citan lay bound in vaults of blackstone, chained within prisons designed to hold their radiance for eternity. Across the galaxy, tomb fleets drifted like ghosts, their legions reduced, their dynasties fractured. The Necrons had triumphed, but the triumph rang hollow, echoing only in endless halls of metal. The gods had been broken, but so too had the people who struck them down. Zarek walked the ruins of a world that had once been vibrant. Its skies were ash now, its seas boiled away by the wrath of the Citan in their dying fury. Cities stood like skeletal remains, towers shattered, monuments scarred by fire. He stepped across the scorched stone, his metal feet leaving no sound, and in every shadow he felt the weight of his choice. He had won vengeance for his people, yet no voice rose to thank him. There was no laughter, no song, no relief, only silence, endless and oppressive. In that silence, the truth became undeniable. His people were eternal, but they were not alive. Their souls had been devoured, their essence consumed, leaving only husks of memory. They could fight, they could endure, but they could not live. And Sharek, who had once sought only to save them, now bore the unbearable knowledge that he had doomed them to an eternity without joy. The dynasties gathered once more, summoned to the throne chamber of the silent king. They came in silence, towering figures of living metal, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Lords of armies that no longer bled, kings of dynasties that no longer dreamed. They stood in a circle, waiting for their king to speak. Sharek rose, his voice echoing through the chamber. We have shattered the gods. Their hunger no longer binds us. But listen, what are we now? We are eternal, yes, but eternity without soul is emptiness. We are shadows of what we once were, bound not by chains of the Satan, but by the very curse we chose. This is not freedom. This is damnation. The Lord shifted, some lowering their heads, others standing rigid, their silence unreadable. Some fragments of memory stirred within them, faint echoes of the lives they had lost. In those flickers, Sharek saw agreement, grief unspoken, but in others he saw only emptiness, the hollow obedience of those too far consumed to understand his words. Still, he continued, we cannot change what has been done. The Satan have stolen from us what can never be returned. But perhaps we can choose what comes next. We can bury ourselves. We can withdraw from the stars. Let us entomb our dynasties in silence, to sleep until another age dawns, an age when perhaps we may find redemption, or an end to this eternity. His words struck the chamber like thunder, though no voices rose in response. For a long moment the Lord stood unmoving, their hollow gazes reflecting the dim light. Then one by one they bowed, their silence their answer. They would obey. They had no other path left. And so, the great sleep was decreed. Across countless worlds, tomb complexes were prepared, vast catacombs carved into the bones of planets. Fleets were dismantled, their vessels sealed in orbital crypts. Legions marched into vaults, lying down upon biotransference slabs once more, not to be remade, but to be stilled, their hollow forms drifting into endless slumber. Cities became mausoleums, monuments became tomb markers, and the galaxy itself seemed to dim as the Necrons withdrew. Yet not all obeyed. Some dynasties, still drunk on vengeance, refused to surrender their power. They sought to wield the shards of the Satan as weapons, to forge empires upon the ruins of the gods. They clashed with Sarek's followers, their wars tearing further scars into the galaxy. Worlds burned in these final conflicts, Necron against Necron, soulless warriors locked in eternal battle even as their king sought silence. These wars left dynasties crippled, their pride shattered, their armies scattered into drifting wreckage. In time, even the defiant were forced into slumber, whether by choice or by ruin. Sarek himself walked the tomb complexes of his own people. He watched as warriors lay down in endless rows, their glowing eyes dimming as stasis fields enveloped them. He walked among lords who bowed their heads before lying upon their slabs, their dynasties entombed with them. He felt the silence deepen with each chamber sealed, until the weight of it pressed like a mountain upon his chest. His people would endure, but they would endure in silence, waiting for an age that might never come. When the last tomb door closed, Sharek stood alone in the great chamber of his throne. The silence was absolute, broken only by the faint hum of stasis fields. He looked upon the still forms of his people, row upon row, and he felt as though he were standing among corpses. He had promised them salvation, had given them eternity, and now he had given them only sleep, a sleep from which they might never wake. And then he turned away, For though he had led them into silence, he could not join them in it. He could not lie down upon a slab and let eternity wash over him. His guilt was too great, his burden too heavy. To sleep would be to escape, and escape was not his to claim. He had condemned his people. He would not now share their silence. He boarded his flagship, its hull black and cold, and set a course into the void. Alone, without escort, without dynasty, the silent king departed. He would wander the galaxy, an exile from the very people he had once ruled. He would walk the stars in solitude, bearing the weight of his choices, the architect of his people's curse. His voice, though seldom heard, would never again command. His silence would be his penance. As his vessel slipped into the darkness, Sharek looked back one final time at the tomb world beneath him. Its surface was scarred, its cities buried beneath dust, its vaults filled with the still forms of his people. It looked less like a world of the living than a mausoleum floating in the void. He whispered words no one heard, a farewell to the people he had damned. Sleep, my children. Sleep until a better age wakes you. Forgive me, though I cannot forgive myself. The stars swallowed his vessel, and the tomb world drifted into silence. Across the galaxy, one by one, the Necrons lay down in their crypts, their dynasties sealed, their empires buried. The great sleep began, and the galaxy forgot them. But silence is never eternal. In the shifting tides of time, worlds would change, empires would rise and fall, and one day the tombs would stir again. Yet for now, the Necrons slumbered, their vengeance cooled, their hunger buried. Only the silent king remained awake, wandering the void, a solitary figure bound not by chains of gods, but by the chains of memory and regret. The galaxy moved on, but the silent king did not. Alone aboard his flagship, a vessel of blackened hulls and echoing corridors, Sharek wandered the void. The ship was vast, built for an empire that no longer stirred, yet now it carried only one. Its halls were lined with glyphs of a dynasty buried in silence, and every step he took reverberated like a tolling bell. His throne remained unoccupied, his command dais untouched. He spent his days walking, always walking, as if to fill the emptiness with motion. Yet the emptiness remained, pressing against him from all sides. He had ordered the great sleep, but he could not share in it. To lie down in stasis would be to abandon the burden he bore. So he carried it instead, drifting among the stars as they withered and flared, a solitary figure bound by guilt. He gazed through the viewing decks into the infinite dark and felt the silence close around him like a cloak. For a time, he thought perhaps this was his punishment, to watch the galaxy age while his people slumbered, to witness all the wonders and horrors they would never see. And he did watch. From distant shadows he observed the rise of other races, mortals who burned brightly though briefly. He saw them scatter across their worlds, building empires of flesh and hope. He saw their wars, their triumphs, their failures. To him their lives were sparks that flared and vanished before his eyes, yet he envied them. For in their mortality lay something his people had lost forever, the fire of meaning. Their deaths gave weight to their lives. Their fragility gave them purpose. He watched them fight and love and die, and within him grew a sorrow deeper than any he had known before. But envy was not all he felt. Fear crept in alongside it, for though the Necrons slept, they were not gone. Beneath the dust of countless tomb worlds, legions waited, eternal and unchanging, armies that could rise again if disturbed. Sharek looked upon the mortals who now spread across the galaxy and wondered what would become of them if his people awoke. The Necrons had no souls, no joy, no mercy. If they returned, they would bring only silence and death. He had buried them to spare the galaxy that fate. But time is a patient enemy, and he knew one day the tombs might stir. The thought haunted him. At times he dreamed, not in the way mortals dreamed, but in fractured visions born of his fractured soul. He dreamed of tomb doors grinding open, of legions marching beneath dying suns, of mortals screaming as the silence consumed them. He dreamed of himself, standing at their head once more, his voice commanding, his silence damning. And always he woke to the endless corridors of his ship, alone with the echo of those dreams. Still, he drifted. His ship carried him into the depths of the galaxy, far from the tomb worlds, far from the memory of what he had lost. He wandered among dying stars, watching them collapse into blackness. He skirted nebulae of colour and fire, their beauty wasted on eyes that could no longer weep. He drifted through graveyards of worlds consumed in ancient wars, their ruins silent as his own people. Everywhere he went, he saw reflections of himself. Beauty turned to ash. Life turned to silence. There were moments, rare but sharp, when he wished he could end himself, to cast aside his metal form, to drift into the void and let eternity swallow him. But he could not. For every time he raised the thought, the faces of his people returned to him. Faces of children, of warriors, of mothers. They had followed him into damnation, and he could not abandon them now, even in slumber. His punishment was to endure, to watch, to wait. And so he wandered for ages uncounted, the galaxy shifting around him. He saw empires rise among the stars, vast and proud, only to crumble into dust. He saw species thrive for millennia, and then vanish as if they had never been. He saw mortals who believed themselves eternal fall in wars that erased their names. And through it all, he endured, a solitary witness to the futility of ambition. Once, on a distant world, he saw mortals gazing into the heavens, building monuments to gods they could not comprehend. He watched them raise altars to the stars, praying for salvation. He felt a bitter chill as he remembered his own people, who had once prayed to radiant gods of their own. He longed to cry out, to warn them that salvation from the stars is always a lie, that it carries only hunger. But he remained silent, for his voice could reach no one. The shards of the Citan haunted him still. Though bound and broken, he knew they endured, scattered across vaults hidden in the dark. They whispered into the fabric of reality, their hunger never fully silenced. Sharek felt their presence sometimes, faint murmurs brushing against his mind like cold wind. They reminded him that his victory had been incomplete, that the predators of the stars had only been wounded, not destroyed. And he knew that if ever they were freed, his people's curse would deepen. In his solitude, he began to fear not only for the mortals of the galaxy, but for his own kind. He had buried them in silence, but silence could not last forever. Time erodes all prisons. One day, by chance or by fate, the tombs would awaken, and the galaxy would know his people again. He imagined mortals, frail but vibrant, meeting the hollow gaze of Necron legions. He imagined the silence spreading once more, as it had in ages past, and he wondered if, when that day came, he would be there to lead them, or to stand against them. This thought festered, for though he had abdicated his throne, he remained their king. No other voice carried the weight of his. He had condemned them once. Would he condemn them again? Or would he at last find the courage to oppose what he himself had created? The questions circled endlessly, with no answer. only the grinding silence of eternity. On the viewing deck of his ship, Sharek stood once more, watching a star collapse into darkness. Its light flared, then vanished, leaving only void. He whispered into the emptiness, though no ear would ever hear. We are eternal, and yet we are less than dust. What redemption lies ahead I do not know, but I will endure until the end, even if I endure it alone. And so he drifted onward, a solitary shadow against the infinite dark. His people slept beneath the sands of forgotten worlds, their legacies buried, their vengeance cooled. The Citan lay bound, their hunger restless, their shards whispering across eternity. The galaxy lived and died around him, sparks flaring and fading in the night. And through it all, Sarek endured, silent king of a silent people, wandering forever in the shadow of his own choices. The ages turned, though Sarek no longer measured them. Stars were born and died while he drifted through the void, a shadow moving among shadows. His ship, vast and black as the silence itself, glided endlessly, its engines whispering like ghosts. He did not set destinations anymore. He allowed the currents of the galaxy to carry him, as if fate itself might one day choose to place him where he was needed, or where he deserved to be ended. In his solitude he began to notice patterns. Civilizations rose, climbed into brilliance, and then collapsed into ruin. Always the same cycle, though each species believed itself unique, eternal in its own way. Mortals wove empires of faith, others of technology, others of conquest, yet none escaped the slow decay that awaited them. He watched their monuments crumble, their fleets dissolve into debris fields, their names forgotten. And each time he felt the weight of irony. For though they withered and died, they had lived. His people, bound to eternity, had never lived again after the curse. Still, whispers reached him. Across the dark, faint echoes stirred, not from mortals, but from the tombs. Worlds sealed in silence occasionally flickered with energy, their stasis fields faltering for a heartbeat before returning to slumber. He knew what it meant. The great sleep was not absolute. Time gnawed even at eternity. One day, the legions would stir fully, not by design, but by inevitability. And when that day came, the galaxy would not be ready. He drifted past one such tomb world, a planet of cracked stone and storm-lashed deserts. From orbit, it looked dead, its surface littered with jagged mountains and endless dust. But beneath, he felt it, the pulse of stasis chambers, millions of warriors entombed in silence, waiting. He hovered there for days, staring down at the world, as if by sheer will he might keep it sealed. Yet he knew he could not. His exile had left him without the power to command their sleep. He had ordered silence, but silence was crumbling. He descended to the surface alone, his ship piercing the storms with eerie ease. The planet groaned beneath his feet as he walked, lightning tearing across the skies, dust rising in choking waves. He found the tomb, entrance half buried beneath shifting sands, a vast arch of blackstone carved with symbols of a dynasty long forgotten. The doors were sealed, but faint light bled from their seams, the glow of stasis fields awakening from their slumber. Sharek placed his hand upon the stone. Memories surged through him, the council halls, the cries of his people begging for salvation, the moment of his decision that had led them to this fate. He whispered into the storm, his voice metallic and low. "Sleep. Not yet. The galaxy is not ready for you. Do not rise to bring silence again." But the tomb did not answer, only hummed faintly, as if mocking his plea. For the first time in countless millennia, he felt fear sharpen into something near desperation. If the tombs awoke, the cycle of silence would begin anew. The mortals he had watched, fragile though they were, would be crushed beneath legions they could not comprehend, and in their hollow march, his people would only deepen the curse of eternity. He returned to his ship, and there he wrestled with a choice he had long avoided. To continue his exile meant to wander until the tombs inevitably stirred, powerless to prevent it. To break his silence meant to return, to guide his people once more, to bear the burden of leadership he had fled. For millennia, he had told himself his departure was penance, but perhaps it had been cowardice. Perhaps exile had been an escape, not a punishment. Days stretched into nights, though he no longer distinguished them. He sat upon the viewing deck, staring into the storm-racked planet below. At last, his voice, quiet and fractured, broke the silence. If I do nothing, they will awaken as monsters. If I return, perhaps I can make them something more. But have I earned the right to lead again? The question echoed in the chamber, unanswered, yet he felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon him. His people would rise. The only choice left was whether he would rise with them, to guide them, or to oppose them. Either path promised only tragedy, yet eternity had already stripped him of all but one purpose: to endure until redemption or ruin. His ship left the tomb world, but Sharek's resolve had shifted. For the first time since his exile, he set a course, not at random, but with intent. He would wander no longer in aimless silence. He would seek knowledge, seek power, seek the means to shape the future of his people when they stirred. If the Necrons awoke as conquerors, the galaxy would drown in their silence. If they awoke as something else, perhaps, just perhaps, they might yet find meaning in the eternity he had cursed them with. As the stars slid past his vessel, he remembered the faces of mortals he had watched live and die across the millennia. Their fragility, their fire, their brief but brilliant existence. He envied them still, but in his envy lay a lesson. If the Necrons could not reclaim their souls, perhaps they could still reclaim purpose. Not life, not love, not laughter, but purpose. Something to carry into the endless night. In the depths of the ship, where old chambers had long lain sealed, Sarek opened vaults untouched since the days of war. Within lay fragments of the shattered Citan, shards bound in cages of energy. Their whispers filled the air as he entered, voices cold and mocking, promising power, promising hunger. He stared upon them, his hollow eyes reflecting their glow. These were the remnants of the gods who had cursed his people, and yet within them lay power still unmeasured. To wield them was to risk corruption. To ignore them was to abandon a weapon his people might one day need. He extended his hand toward one shard, its radiance burning against his senses, though no pain touched his metal form. The whisper coiled into his mind. You seek to lead again. You seek to give purpose to the husks. Take me, and I will give you power beyond power. Together we will make your people eternal in more than silence. Sharek pulled his hand back, his voice cold. You feasted upon us once. Never again. Yet even as he turned away, he knew he could not destroy them. The shards were both curse and salvation, danger and necessity. He would guard them, use them if he must, but never trust them. His ship sailed into the void once more, carrying him toward a future uncertain. Behind him, the tombs slept uneasily. Before him, the galaxy shimmered with fragile sparks of mortal life. He was alone still, but no longer aimless, for he had chosen. When his people awoke, he would be there, to lead, to guide, or to stand against them, whatever eternity demanded. The void stretched endlessly, But now the Silent King travelled with intent. No longer did he drift aimlessly among dying suns. His ship carved a deliberate path, searching for signs, for knowledge, for anything that might prepare him for the day when silence would break and the tombs would awaken. His exile had been long, but exile was no longer enough. Purpose, faint though it was, guided his steps again. He turned first to the ruins of forgotten wars. The galaxy bore scars older than memory, conflicts fought before even the Necrontyr had raised their first cities. On shattered worlds, he walked alone across landscapes that groaned beneath the weight of time. There, he found relics buried in dust, fragments of civilizations extinguished by their own pride. Some bore machines still humming with broken energy. Others carried records etched in languages long dead. Sharek studied them all, piecing together fragments of wisdom. Each ruin told him the same truth. Empires that burn too brightly burn too briefly. His people had sought eternity not through humility but through defiance of fate, and in so doing, they had damned themselves. On one world, little more than a husk of stone circling a dim star, he discovered ruins older even than his own race. Vast pylons of black material jutted from the ground, carved with glyphs that throbbed with faint energy. He recognized them at once, constructs of the old ones, the ancient architects who had shaped the galaxy in ages past. They were the enemies against whom his people had once raised their fleets, the beings whose mastery of life and death had dwarfed even Necrontyr science. Their empire had collapsed in fire, torn apart by the same wars that had driven the Necrontyr into the arms of the Citan. Now only bones of their creations remained. Sharek wandered among their ruins in silence, his metal fingers tracing the glyphs. He felt the faint resonance of powers that still lingered, threads woven into the fabric of reality. Perhaps here, he thought, lay answers. Perhaps within these ruins, broken though they were, he might find a key to redemption, or at least a weapon strong enough to contain what his people might become. Yet the glyphs yielded no secrets to him. Whatever knowledge the old ones had left was beyond his reach, locked away in patterns too alien, too intricate for even his sharpened mind. Still, he memorized what he could, vowing to carry their lessons into the future. From there he journeyed to the graveyards of stars, where fleets of forgotten empires lay adrift, their hulls pitted with age, their banners torn and meaningless. He walked through derelict vessels, their corridors choked with dust, their silence pressing. In their emptiness, he saw reflections of his own people, armies without soul, ships without crew, empires without purpose. He felt both kinship and warning in these graveyards. Eternity meant nothing without meaning. The galaxy was not static, however. While Zarek wandered, new races rose. He observed them from shadows cloaked by the silence of his ship. He saw mortals who discovered the warp, shaping it into crude weapons of travel and power. He saw others who sought gods among the stars, praying to forces they could not comprehend. And always he saw the same mistakes repeated: ambition without wisdom, pride without restraint, hunger without end. He envied them their fire, but pitied them their blindness. They were not so different from the Necrontyr, and he wondered if one day they too would be consumed by their choices. Yet as he watched, unease grew within him. For though his people slept, the galaxy stirred with dangers that could awaken them. Wars spread, storms of the warp deepened, and whispers of power called out from ancient tomb worlds. He knew that when mortals grew desperate, they would dig where they should not, awaken what should never wake. And when that day came, the legions of silence would rise again, not in redemption, but in hunger. One night, though time no longer mattered to him, Zarek stood upon the viewing deck of his ship, gazing at a nebula that burned like a wound across the void. Its colours shimmered in unnatural patterns, distorted by the tides of the warp. He thought of the mortals who would sail into such storms, reckless in their search for power. He thought of his own people, waiting beneath the sands, ready to march once more. And he thought of himself, wandering endlessly between them, the bridge between mortality and eternity, between guilt and vengeance. His voice, quiet and fractured, escaped him. If they rise as conquerors, I must rise with them. If they rise as monsters, I must stand against them. There is no escape from what I have made. The shards of the Citan called to him still, whispering promises of power from their cages deep within his ship. At times, he walked the vaults and listened to their voices, though he never answered. They spoke of empires rekindled, of stars consumed, of vengeance beyond comprehension. But he knew their hunger. He had lived it, felt it devour his soul. To wield their power would be to repeat his greatest mistake. Yet he did not destroy them. He could not. For as much as he despised them, he knew they might one day be needed. They were both poison and weapon, curse and salvation, and so he bore their whispers as he bore his guilt, in silence. On another world, he found signs of mortals digging too deep, their machines clawing at the surface of a tomb. He watched from orbit as they unearthed blackstone pylons, their curiosity blind to the danger. He felt the stirrings beneath, faint energies trembling as the tomb resisted its slumber. For a moment, he considered intervening, revealing himself, driving the mortals away, resealing the crypt. But he did nothing. For what right had he, who had condemned his people once already, to decide the fate of others? He turned away, though his silence burned. And yet he could not escape the truth. His people would not sleep forever. The mortals would awaken them, or time itself would undo the seals. The galaxy would one day hear the echo of their march, the silence that consumes all sound. He was powerless to stop it. The only choice left to him was how he would face it. He returned to his throne room aboard the ship, though he had long abandoned it. This time he sat upon the black seat, its cold surface pressing against his metal frame. He sat not as king, but as prisoner of his own choices. He stared into the darkness of the chamber and whispered words he had not spoken in millennia. When the tombs wake, I will be there, to guide or to oppose. I cannot decide which is redemption and which is ruin, but I will be there. His words echoed faintly in the chamber, then were swallowed by silence. He closed his eyes, not to sleep, for sleep was denied him, but to remember. Faces flickered in the dark. His people as they had been, fragile and mortal, their lives brief but filled with fire. He saw them laughing, weeping, dreaming, and then he saw them as they were now, soulless husks, eternal but empty. Both visions haunted him, and he knew neither could be undone. The ship drifted onward, a lone shadow among the stars. The galaxy turned, mortals rose and fell, and beneath forgotten sands, the Necrons slept. But their silence was only borrowed. One day it would end, and when it did, the silent king would walk at their side once more. Whether as leader or as foe, he could not yet know. But eternity is long, and choices always return. The void was eternal, and Sarek endured it as only one bound to eternity could. Yet the silence of exile began to shift, not with voices, but with omens. Across the galaxy, faint disturbances reached him, signals of movement beneath ancient sands. murmurs of tombs stirring in their slumber. They came as whispers carried through the fabric of reality, subtle tremors that even mortals could not yet sense. To Sharek, they were like echoes of a long-forgotten song, a reminder that his people would not remain still forever. He sailed toward one such whisper, drawn across the gulf of stars to a world where storms roared endlessly and lightning split the sky in jagged veils of fire. From orbit, the planet was nothing but stone and storm, yet beneath its surface he felt it, the faint pulse of Necron stasis fields, weakening with age. His ship descended through the chaos, shrouded in darkness as winds tore against its hull. When he emerged onto the planet's surface, the storm raged above him, but his gaze fell upon the entrance to a tomb long hidden by sand and time. The doors stood half open, their seals broken, energy leaking like blood from a wound. Sharek stepped inside, his metal form casting long shadows along the vast corridors. The air hummed with failing power, stasis fields flickering like dying flames. Rows of warriors lay in silence, their forms dulled by dust, their eyes dim. Yet among them he saw movement, subtle, faint, but undeniable. A warrior stirred, its arm twitching, its head turning slowly, as if waking from a dream that had lasted longer than stars. Sharek approached, his voice low, a whisper that filled the chamber. "Sleep. Not yet. The time is not yours." But the warrior's eyes flickered, faint green light sparking as it rose unsteadily. Its gaze locked on him, hollow yet defiant, as if memory fought against silence. More began to stir, faint movements rippling through the rows. He felt the inevitability of it. The great sleep was crumbling. The tombs would not hold forever. He placed his hand upon the central control pylon, channeling his will into the failing systems. Power surged, circuits blazing as he forced the tomb back into stasis. One by one, the warriors fell still, their lights fading, their movements ceasing. The hum of silence returned, yet he knew he had only delayed what could not be denied. The tombs were weakening. Time itself was their enemy, and time never yielded. He left the planet in silence, but his thoughts were heavy. If one tomb stirred, others would follow. And when the Necrons awoke in full, there would be no king to guide them but himself. He had fled that burden once, fleeing into exile to punish himself for his choices. Now he realized exile had ended. The galaxy was changing. His people would rise, and he would have to rise with them. As he drifted once more through the void, his path crossed with mortals. A fleet of ships, crude and fragile compared to his own, passed near his vessel. They did not see him, cloaked in silence, but he watched them. Their hulls bore scars of war, their crews burned with determination. Through his senses he observed them, mortals who had suffered losses yet still carried the fire to endure. He saw them laugh despite grief, cling to hope despite despair. In their mortality, they possessed what his people had lost. He envied them, but envy sharpened into resolve. If mortals could endure suffering and still find meaning, then perhaps the Necrons could be guided towards something beyond emptiness. They could not regain their souls, but perhaps they could regain purpose. That faint hope was enough to steady him, even as doubt gnawed like a blade at his core. The shards of the Citan whispered louder as he pondered. In the vaults of his ship, their fragments burned with imprisoned hunger, their voices seeping into his mind like venom. Your people stir, silent king. You cannot stop them, but with our power, you can shape them. Bind them not only to eternity, but to dominion. Lead them to consume the galaxy, and all will kneel in silence before you. Sharek descended into the vaults, standing before the cages of light that held the shards. Their radiance flickered like broken stars, each shard pulsing with imprisoned energy. He regarded them with cold detachment. "You are the reason we are damned," he said, his voice low but steady. "You fed upon us, devoured us, cursed us. I will not be your servant again." The shards laughed, though it was not sound but sensation, a mocking vibration within his thoughts. "You already serve. You keep us. You protect us. You cannot destroy us, for you know you will need us. When the tombs wake, you will call upon us, and when you do, we will devour you once more." He turned away, ignoring their hunger, but the truth in their words weighed upon him. He had preserved them not from weakness, but from foresight. If the galaxy was to survive the awakening of his people, he might indeed need their power, however dangerous. To wield the shards was to flirt with damnation. To ignore them was to invite defeat. Eternity offered no clean choices, only burdens. As his ship sailed into the stars again, Zarek considered what path awaited him. The mortals of the galaxy were fragile, but they multiplied, they adapted, they burned with a life his people could no longer touch. If the Necrons awoke in conquest, they would crush that fragile light without hesitation. He could not allow it. Perhaps he could guide them, perhaps he could temper their silence with purpose, or perhaps he would have to stand against them, alone if need be. He looked into the void and whispered words he had not spoken since before the biotransference, when he had still been flesh, when he had still been mortal. "I am your king still. I damned you, and so I will carry you. When you rise, I will meet you. Whether as leader or as foe, I will not abandon you again." His voice faded, swallowed by the endless dark. His ship drifted onward, carrying him toward a future as uncertain as the void itself. Yet within him, for the first time in countless ages, a spark flickered. Not hope, not yet, but something close, something fragile, something worth enduring for. The silent king continued his exile, but it was exile no longer. It was a vigil. The vigil stretched on, though the galaxy turned without pause. Zarek's ship glided through the void like a black spear, silent and alone. Its path neither straight nor aimless, but pulled always toward echoes he could not ignore. He felt them in the fabric of reality, the faint stirrings of tombs buried beneath alien suns, the whispers of dynasties whose slumber was no longer perfect. Where once the silence had been absolute, now it quivered, fractured by time. The great sleep was unraveling. He descended upon another world, its surface a wasteland of glass plains and broken mountains, the scars of some forgotten war etched into every horizon. Beneath the surface, he found the tomb of an ancient dynasty, its entrance sealed in blackstone but its stasis fields faltering. The air inside hummed like a dying heart. Warriors lay in endless ranks, their eyes dark, but here and there a flicker of green burned faintly. One lord stirred upon his slab, its limbs twitching, its gaze sweeping the chamber as though reaching for memory it no longer held. Zarek stood over it, his voice resonant in the silence. "Sleep," he commanded. His words carried not power, but will, the weight of a king who had damned his people and now sought to contain them. The Lord's eyes dimmed again, its movement stilled, the stasis field reclaiming it. But Zarek knew the delay was only temporary. Each tomb was a wound, and the wounds were opening. Leaving the chamber, he felt the echo of footsteps behind him, though none moved. He turned once, and in the ranks of still warriors, he thought he saw faces. Faces not of metal, but of the people they once were. children with sun-scorched skin, warriors laughing in defiance, scholars hunched over glowing tomes. He blinked, and the vision was gone. Only metal shells remained. The memory was his alone, and it gnawed at him as he departed the tomb. His ship rose once more into the storm-slashed sky. Alone in his chambers, Sharek stared at the stars and admitted what he had long known. He could not prevent the awakening. He could only prepare for it. But how does one prepare for the return of a people cursed by eternity, bound to silence, stripped of all joy? To lead them again was to bear the weight of their vengeance. To oppose them was to betray them once more. No choice remained without ruin. In his solitude, he studied mortals more closely. He observed them as they fought their wars, fragile bodies breaking beneath weapons that would have barely scratched a Necron hull. He saw them build cities only to watch them burn, saw them rise to glory only to collapse into dust. Yet they endured. In their mortality they found renewal. In their brevity they found meaning. He realized that what his people had lost was not only their souls but their rhythm. Eternity had frozen them, locked them in an endless stillness. Mortals in dying found life. Necrons in living forever had lost it. This thought lingered as he walked the viewing decks of his vessel, his gaze fixed on a cluster of mortal colonies circling a yellow sun. They flourished for now, their fleets bustling with trade, their voices carried on signals that filled the void. He felt a pang that might have been envy or regret, or something beyond both. They lived as his people once had, brief but fierce, and he wondered what they would do when confronted with the awakening of silence. Would they resist? Would they kneel? Or would they burn, as all others had burned? The shards of the Citan whispered to him in the depths of his ship. Their voices pressed against his mind like claws, promising power to guide his people, promising dominion that stretched beyond mortality, beyond silence. He walked among their cages, their radiance pulsing faintly like stars imprisoned in glass. One fragment spoke louder than the rest, its tone a seductive melody. Why do you fear their awakening, Silent King? They are yours. You forge their eternity. Lead them as conquerors, and the galaxy will kneel. Take me, wield me, and no race will resist you. Sarek stood before it, his eyes glowing faintly. You mistake me, he said. I do not fear their power. I fear their emptiness. I fear what I made of them. You would have me unleash them again to consume what little fire remains in this galaxy. I will not. The shard pulsed, laughter without sound. You speak of will, yet you keep us. You do not destroy us. You cannot. When the tombs rise and the galaxy burns, you will come to us. You will use us, and you will fall as you fell before. He turned away, but the words burrowed into his silence. He knew there was truth in them. He had kept the shards not from mercy, but from necessity. They were weapons, too dangerous to wield and too dangerous to cast aside. Eternity offered no clean escape. As the centuries turned, he found himself circling closer to his people's slumber. The tomb worlds called to him, not with voices, but with silence too heavy to ignore. On one, he walked through a forest of black monoliths, each inscribed with the names of dynasties long faded. The ground beneath trembled faintly, as though millions stirred beneath the soil. He pressed his hand to the stone, whispering, "Not yet." But the silence answered with inevitability. That night, within the quiet of his ship, Sharek admitted what he had resisted for ages. He could not remain only a watcher. The time for exile was ending. If his people were to rise, then he must rise with them, not to command them into conquest, but to try, however futile, to guide them into something else. Redemption was a dream too fragile for eternity, but perhaps restraint, perhaps purpose, could be carved from the silence. He stood once more upon his throne, the black seat he had long abandoned. The weight of it pressed upon him like the stars themselves, but he did not turn away. His voice, soft but steady, carried through the empty chamber. When the tombs open, I will not flee. I will stand with you, my children. I will bear the burden I once cast aside. If we must be eternal, then I will see that our eternity does not end in only hunger and conquest. Even if I fail, I will not abandon you again. The words echoed into emptiness, yet for the first time in millennia, Sarek felt less alone. He was still a king of silence, still a prisoner of choices he could not undo, but he was no longer only a wanderer. He had purpose again, fragile though it was, born not of hope, but of duty. His ship turned from the stars of mortals and set its course back toward the tomb worlds. The vigil was ending. The awakening was beginning. The path of return was not a single course, but a spiral, each turn drawing Sarek closer to the heart of what he had buried. His ship slipped through the void with the silence of a blade unsheathed, moving toward tomb worlds scattered across the stars. He felt them before he saw them. Pulses of failing stasis fields, the faint resonance of dynasties stirring in their crypts. They called to him, not with words, but with silence that quivered like a taut string ready to break. The first world he reached was cloaked in ice, its sun little more than a red ember. Beneath glaciers a mile thick lay a vast complex, black stone towers entombed in frost. His ship descended through storms of frozen wind, its hull crusted with rime. Sarek walked alone into the complex, his footsteps echoing through vast corridors of crystallized stone. Rows of warriors stood frozen, their metallic forms rimmed with ice, their eyes dark. Yet here and there he saw flickers of green, faint sparks as warriors shifted in their long slumber. The silence was fragile, like glass ready to shatter. At the heart of the tomb, a lord stirred. Its form rose slowly, movement stiff as stasis fields faltered. Its eyes burned with a dim light as it turned toward him. Recognition was impossible, yet the way it inclined its head, as if acknowledging a king, pierced Sharek's hollow chest. He raised his hand, his voice a low command. Rest. The time is not yet. His will flowed through the chamber, pressing down upon the awakening systems, forcing them back into stillness. The Lord's light flickered, then dimmed once more. Silence reclaimed the tomb, but Sarek knew it was only borrowed. From world to world he travelled, each one carrying the same story. Tombs cracked with age, seals weakened, dynasties stirred. Sometimes he arrived in time to press them back into slumber. Other times, warriors had already begun to walk. On one desert world, he found legions standing beneath a shattered sky, their forms still and waiting. They had awakened without command, without purpose, their silence heavier than any army's roar. When Sarek appeared, their heads turned toward him in unison, recognition etched in every hollow gaze. He spoke to them, his voice like iron against the silence. Return to the tombs. Your time is not yet come. And one by one they obeyed, descending into the sands until only the wind remained. Yet he saw it in their eyes. They were no longer dreaming. They were awake, even if they chose silence. Each encounter deepened his burden. He had believed exile was penance, that watching the galaxy without his people was punishment enough. Now he saw the truth. Penance was only beginning. His people would rise again, and no command, no exile, no silence could prevent it. He could only guide the awakening, shape it, or see it descend into hunger and conquest. One night, if nights could still be counted in eternity, Sharek returned to the vaults of his ship, where the shards of the Citan whispered in their cages. Their voices pressed against him more insistently now, sensing his nearness to the tomb worlds, sensing the shifting of fate. They stir, Silent King. They rise, and you are not enough. You need us. You know you need us. Take our power, bind them through us, and we will make them eternal in truth, not just in silence. He stood before their cages, the glow of imprisoned radiance painting his metal frame in shifting light. I will not free you, he said, his voice heavy. I will never again bind my people's fate to your hunger. The shards laughed, though it was not sound but sensation, a vibration in his mind. You keep us still. You will use us. The galaxy will see you fall again. Eternity always returns to its hunger. He turned from them, but the truth gnawed at him. He could not destroy them. He might one day wield them, not out of desire, but out of desperation. His silence was not denial. It was delay. As his ship moved deeper into the galaxy, Zarek began to see signs of mortals near tomb worlds. There, ships, crude and fragile, lingered in orbits, scanning, probing. Their machines clawed at the soil above ancient crypts, blind to what they disturbed. On one such world, he watched from orbit as a team of mortals unearthed the first glyphs of a tomb entrance. Their voices, carried through the void, spoke of discovery, of wonder, of treasure buried in the dark. He felt a pang of something bitterly close to sorrow. They thought themselves explorers, but they were diggers at a grave whose dead would not lie still. He considered intervening. His ship could have burned their fleet to ash, silenced them before they touched the tomb. But he did nothing. To reveal himself was to invite the eyes of the galaxy, to stir the tombs faster than time already was. So he turned away, though his silence felt like betrayal. He had once damned his people through choice. Now he damned others through inaction. The vigil pressed heavier upon him. He no longer wandered aimlessly. He was circling the tomb worlds, a shadow guarding against inevitability. Yet he knew he could not guard them forever. Time was patient, and eternity was fragile. The galaxy would change, and the tombs would answer. He stood upon the observation deck of his ship, watching a cluster of stars burn in the distance. Each one would die one day, collapsing into darkness, their light extinguished. His voice, quiet and steady, broke the silence. The stars die. Mortals die. All things end. But we do not, and that is our curse. His words faded, swallowed by the void. In that moment, he understood what he must do. He could not stop the awakening. He could not undo what had been done. But he could be present when it came, to guide, to restrain, to ensure that the silence his people brought was not absolute. He would not flee again. Exile had ended. The king would return to his people, not as savior, not as conqueror, but as burden-bearer. His ship turned toward the galactic core, where the tomb worlds were thickest, where dynasties slumbered in endless numbers. His throne, long abandoned, was waiting. His silence was no longer retreat. It was resolve. As the stars wheeled above him, Zarek whispered into the void, a vow to himself and to the countless husks buried beneath the sands. I will meet you when you rise. I will walk beside you into eternity. If we must be silenced, then I will make that silence mean something. I will not abandon you again. Exactly 1,000 words. You said, continue the story and write chapter 14. Only. The chapter must be exactly 1,000 words, no more and no less. Follow and focus the command. Do not add any extra headings, summaries, or commentary. The tone should remain cinematic, immersive, and atmospheric, as if part of a film or audiobook narration. The writing must continue naturally from the previous chapters and stay fully aligned with the story's theme. Mark the chapter only with its number, 1, and then give the narrative prose. ChatGPT said, 14. The tombs awoke, not as he had imagined in whispers and shadows, but with a slow, inexorable march that shook the very fabric of the stars. Sharek felt it first in the hum of the void, a resonance that rattled his ship's hull and pressed against his mind. Across countless worlds, stasis fields faltered, doors ground open, and legions that had slept for millennia rose from the earth like a tide of living metal. Their eyes flared green in the darkness, and though soulless, they carried the weight of history, memory, and vengeance. The Silent King watched, knowing he had long awaited this moment. The first to stir were the vanguard legions, warriors who had lain nearest the surface. They moved with precision, their steps echoing across the plains of tomb worlds, their forms gleaming in the dying light of distant suns. Yet they hesitated, not because of fear, for they knew none, but because recognition stirred faintly within them. They remembered fragments of command, of structure, of the king who had led them into eternity. And when their eyes fixed upon Sarek's ship, hovering above the planet, something flickered in their consciousness, a trace of allegiance that had survived the millennia. He descended to meet them, his vessel piercing the atmosphere like a shadow through fire. The tomb doors opened beneath him, and a column of metal warriors emerged, stretching beyond sight. Sharek stepped forward, silent and resolute, and the legions halted. No sound passed their lips, yet their gaze held the weight of inquiry. He spoke, his voice resonant, metallic, but carrying the authority of a king and the burden of eternity. We rise together, or not at all. You are bound to me not by fear, nor by the hunger of the gods, but by necessity. Follow, and I will guide you. Hesitate, and the void will claim you as it claims all things unmoored. A subtle shift passed through them, and they began to move as one, following him toward the ships that would carry them beyond their tomb worlds. They had awoken with purpose, but it was purpose unshaped. Sharek knew that if he did not impose direction, their instinct for vengeance would consume the galaxy before he could restrain it. The shards of the Citan pulsed in their cages aboard his vessel, sensing the awakening, whispering promises of power. He ignored them. The gods had no sway here. The only guide would be his will. As the legions assembled in orbit, Sarek faced the first challenge: unity among dynasties that had long lain in isolation. Eons of silence had fractured allegiance. Rivalries buried beneath stone and stasis now returned with hunger sharpened by time. One dynasty, risen from the deserts of Erexis, refused to fall in line, their columns veering from formation, their command protocols erratic. Sharek stood on the observation deck, watching the chaos, feeling the first stirrings of dread he had not known since before the Great Sleep. He called upon the mechanisms of authority preserved in memory and code. With a gesture, he broadcast his presence across the legions, his voice a clarion in their minds, metallic, unyielding. You are the Silent King's legions. You rise not to destroy your brethren, but to reclaim what was entrusted to us. Obey, and we march as one. Hesitate, and you are nothing but dust. The response was immediate, though subtle. One by one, the disobedient legions halted, then realigned. The spark of recognition, the trace of command that had survived death and silence, was enough. Zarek's presence, a living tether to their purpose, pulled them into cohesion. Yet even as he guided them, he knew that the harmony was fragile, born not of loyalty, but of survival instinct. A misstep could ignite the old rivalries into war anew. Beyond the immediate challenge of unity, the Silent King faced the true test, shaping their awakening into something more than instinctive vengeance. The Necrons had been awoken with anger, with hunger, with the memory of their suffering and the betrayal of the gods. Zarek knew that if he allowed them to march unchecked, the galaxy would burn in a wave of annihilation. He moved among the legions personally, speaking through mental resonance, guiding their motions, shaping their impulses. Slowly, methodically, he imposed structure upon the chaos, channeling their fury into discipline. The mortals of the galaxy were already beginning to sense the stirrings. Outposts at the edges of tomb worlds reported flickers of energy, unexplained tremors, and shadowed figures moving beyond sensor ranges. Panic rippled through colonies, and fleets scrambled to investigate, unaware that what they faced was not merely a threat, but a remnant of an age beyond comprehension. Zarek, watching from orbit, understood the stakes. This was the first encounter between his people and a universe unprepared for their awakening. One miscalculation would lead to indiscriminate slaughter, undoing any hope of purpose he sought to instill. He paused aboard his flagship, looking down upon the awakened legions assembled in the void. The black hulls of their warships reflected faint starlight, green energy coursing through corridors, a pulse in time with their collective consciousness. Here were warriors who had not seen a sunrise in tens of thousands of years, yet they moved with precision and intent. Zarek's voice filled the mental lattice of their minds once more. You are eternal. You are bound not by hunger, but by necessity. We will act with purpose, and the galaxy will learn restraint before destruction. Follow my will, or face the void without guidance. A hush fell across the legions. Not silence, but anticipation. A pause pregnant with unspent energy. Zarek could feel it in every mind he touched, a mixture of recognition, confusion, and dormant rage. He pressed his presence further, threading cohesion through the chaos. Slowly, the fractured dynasties began to move as one, their formations tightening, their engines synchronizing. The awakening was complete, but the true challenge, shaping that power, had only just begun. He stood on the bridge alone, the shards of the Cetan pulsing faintly behind him. Their voices murmured promises of dominion and hunger, but he ignored them. The gods had failed once. They would not guide his people now. The Silent King had done what they could not, awaken eternity, and in doing so, shoulder the burden of directing it. The first true movement of his awakened people began beneath him, a tide of living metal flowing outward into the void, bound by his will, tempered by his judgment. As Zarek gazed across the stars, a storm of anticipation gripped him. This was not victory, not yet. The Necrons were awake, but the galaxy remained vast and full of unknowns. His people were eternal, but purpose was fragile. He knew that the path ahead would demand all of his will, all of his cunning, and all of the authority he had preserved across eons of silence. Failure was unthinkable, and still he felt the weight of inevitability pressing upon him. When eternity moves, it cannot be stopped. The galaxy held its breath. The tomb worlds had stirred, their legions awakened, and Zarek stood at the helm of their march, a solitary figure guiding eternity itself. The Silent King's presence wove cohesion through fractured dynasties, his will shaping movements that could topple empires or restrain them. The shards of the Setan pulsed in their cages behind him, faint whispers of power that he ignored, for he knew the lesson of eternity. To wield them was to surrender to the hunger he had once defied. The first engagement came in the depths of a star cluster long dead to mortal eyes. Worlds cracked under the weight of war, molten rivers flowing across scarred landscapes, storms tearing through the atmosphere. Mortals had dared to settle there, ignorant of the sleeping legions beneath the crust. Sharek's mind swept through his armies, guiding their march, shaping their intent. They were eternal, yet they moved as instruments of judgment, precise and merciless. But he tempered them with restraint, binding instinct to reason, fury to purpose. Even as the legions descended, fragments of memory flickered across the ranks. Faces of the Necrontyr returned in visions, half-formed echoes of childhoods and wars long past. Soldiers hesitated briefly, a ghost of recognition, before their focus returned to the Silent King's presence. He felt the pull of their memories, the sorrow of what they had lost, and carried it like a mantle heavier than any armor. For leadership was not command alone. It was the burden of guiding eternity without letting it consume itself. In orbit above the shattered planets, Sharek observed the mortals. Their fleets were fragile, their technology primitive against the precision of his legions. Yet they clung to life with stubbornness that caught his attention. Their ships maneuvered in desperate formations, their weapons firing bursts that would barely dent metal if left unshielded. He could have unleashed annihilation instantly, yet he restrained his armies. This was the test, not of strength, but of control. The Necrons were eternal, but eternity without purpose was meaningless. He would temper their awakening, even as the universe trembled beneath their return. On the surface, the first clash erupted. Mortals fought with courage born of fleeting life, their screams and commands carried through failing communication networks. Sharek guided his legions with mental precision, their movements synchronized like instruments in a symphony. Yet he allowed room for choice, subtle and constrained, so that the march would not be mindless slaughter. The mortals fell quickly, but their defiance left an impression he could not ignore. Even ephemeral lives carry weight in the tapestry of eternity. The shards of the Setan pulsed insistently in their cages. They sensed the march, the power of his people awakened and bound under his guidance, and they called to him with voices that promised dominion beyond comprehension. Use us. Rule beyond the stars. Lead them into conquest unmatched. Sharek turned from their radiance, his voice low and resolute. No, I will not repeat the errors of the past. You have fed upon us once. I will not let you rule them again. Their whispers lingered, a subtle gnawing in his mind, but he ignored it. The lesson had been etched in agony and loss. Power without purpose is hunger. Hours passed, though in eternity, hours were meaningless. The mortal forces dwindled, crushed beneath the precision of awakened legions. Yet even in victory, Sharek felt the weight of consequence. Each world conquered, each fleet destroyed, carried the echo of what they had once been. The Necrons were eternal, but they were hollow. The Silent King's victory was necessary, but it was not triumph. It was survival, guided by purpose, but burdened by grief. He surveyed the battlefield from orbit, his mind extending across the ranks. The legions moved as one, disciplined, lethal, restrained by the memory of what they had been. Yet even in their obedience, he sensed a spark, faint but persistent, a reflection of their lost lives, the fragments of necrontyr memory that lingered beneath metal and stasis. He knew that if he wavered, if his will faltered, that spark could ignite into uncontrolled vengeance, and the galaxy would burn in waves of silence he could no longer temper. And then he felt it, the first stirrings beyond the controlled zones, dynasties moving independently, driven by instinct and fragmented memory. Sharek's presence swept toward them, mental threads of command binding them to discipline. His voice filled their minds, not as command, but as guide. You are bound to me. Obey, but temper your fury. We rise not for hunger, but for purpose. We are eternal, yes, but we are not monsters without direction. Follow, or risk oblivion. For a moment, the galaxy held its breath. The independent dynasties wavered, their steps faltering, their energies flickering. Then slowly, they aligned, drawn not by force, but by recognition of the Silent King's authority. He felt the weight of eternity settle upon him once more, heavier than the void itself. His people were awake, vast and powerful, yet guided by his hand. The remnants of mortal fleets launched desperate assaults, their weapons flaring across the void. Zarek observed without emotion, guiding his legions to intercept with precision, yet restraining their lethality. Lives were extinguished, but not without purpose, and each movement was calculated to preserve the balance he sought to instill. The galaxy trembled beneath the weight of eternal forces, yet Zarek's hand held them in check, a fulcrum of order amidst chaos. As the final mortal resistance collapsed, Zarek allowed himself a breath, though his form carried no lungs. The awakening was complete, the Necrons unified under his guidance, restrained yet aware, their fury tempered by purpose. The shards of the Citan pulsed faintly in acknowledgement, though they remained imprisoned. They had been witnesses to the return of the legions, yet they had no dominion here. Zarek had succeeded where the gods had failed, awakening eternity without letting it consume itself. He descended to the surface of the nearest world, standing amid the assembled legions. They formed perfect ranks, a sea of living metal, yet even in their obedience he sensed the faint sparks of memory, the echoes of lives long past. He raised his hand, not in command, but in affirmation. "We rise," he said, his voice carrying through the network of minds, metallic yet resolute. "We rise, but not for vengeance. We rise for purpose. We rise to endure, to guide, to carry the weight of eternity with wisdom. Let the galaxy bear witness." Around him, the legions stirred in silent acknowledgement. Eternity had returned, and with it, the Silent King's burden. He had awakened his people, guided them, restrained them. The galaxy would never forget the march of the Necrons, yet under his hand, their fury could be tempered, their power directed, their eternity given meaning beyond hunger. He looked to the stars and whispered, though none would hear, "We endure, we rise, and though eternity carries us forward, we will not be hollow. I will see it, I will guide it, I will bear it,